Well, it finally happened. The SD card in my Raspberry Pi 4 gave up, and my Pi 4 would no longer boot up with Home Assistant. So what I'm going to do today is we're going to install an SSD and boot off of the SSD rather than booting off the micro SD card. This is something I should have done a very long time ago, putting this on the SSD. Micro SD cards fail all the time, and running a system using the SD card is not going to be reliable long term. We've come a long way with the ability to boot off SD or SSD drives, USB drives, and so I'm going to show you that today. It's really a super simple process and won't take too long at all. So let's get started. All right, so obviously there's some prerequisites that you need first before you get started. You need a Raspberry Pi, and I'm using the Raspberry Pi 4 because that's the process that we're going to follow today. Some of the earlier versions of the Raspberry Pi have a little bit different process to follow. You need some sort of SSD drive. I'm using this Kingston 240 gigabyte SSD drive, and you need some sort of adapter to make this work. There are varying levels of success based on the adapter that you get and the drive you get. So make sure you're getting one that's compatible with that. And I'll put a link into a list of compatible drives down in the description below. Also, you need this right here, which is the adapter between the SSD and the USB port. Again, make sure you get one that works with this. Some of them do not work correctly. And then you obviously need an SSD card. I'm using this one here because we'll start with the SSD card and get your Raspberry Pi 4 set up. And of course, you'll need a little USB to SD card device, which is this little thing I have right here. Okay, so before we get started, we need to go get a program from the Raspberry Pi website. So we'll jump over here, and what you need is the Raspberry Pi Imager. This one will be able to write to the SD card and get you what you need. We're not installing Home Assistant quite yet. We're just going to install the Imager. So we'll download it for Windows, and I already have that here. So once you have it ready to go, what you're going to do is you're going to choose the OS, and the OS is going to be a MISC Utility Images. So you want to make sure you choose the MISC Utility Images, and you want to install the bootloader. Now you want to do a USB boot, and this is what it's going to tell the Raspberry Pi to boot from the USB. Otherwise, it'll boot from the SD card. So it does have a fallback. If your USB drive is not plugged in, you can still boot off the SD card. And then you're going to choose your storage. I happen to have just one device in here, which is that little SD card. And we're going to go ahead and write it. And it's going to erase everything that's on the drive. So do we want to continue? Yes, we do. So that will take a moment to write. And when we're done, we'll come back here in just a second. Okay, the USB boot has been written to the mass storage device. We can now remove the SD card from the reader. So we'll continue there. All right, so the next step we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and pull out the SD card from the PC, and we're going to put it in our Raspberry Pi that goes in the little slot in the SD slot on the Raspberry Pi. And you're going to boot up the Raspberry Pi, and when you boot up the Raspberry Pi, it's going to write to a section of the Raspberry Pi itself that tells it to do the USB boot. While this is booting up and doing its configuration into USB boot mode, we can go ahead and flash our Home Assistant image on our SSD drive. So let me get this plugged in, and then we'll get started on flashing the image. Okay, so I've got the Raspberry Pi plugged in and it's doing its thing, and I need to hook up my, I need to put together my drive. So I'm just going to take the drive adapter and just plug it into the drive. That's pretty standard stuff. Make sure you get it lined up the right way. It just plugs in. And then I'm going to plug it into a USB port on my computer. Okay, so after you plug in the disk, you need to make sure that Windows recognizes the disk. And you can use the disk management utility that Windows provides and look and see whether or not this shows up. So here's the disk right here. And I have played with this before, so I'm just going to go ahead and erase it and reformat it so that it's ready to go. And you want to format it with FAT or FAT32. And I'm going to do a quick format on it. Make sure it's the correct device. Don't format your operating system device. So I'll do that here. And it asks me if I want to format everything and erase it all, and I do. Once you've got your disk ready to go, then we need to go into Balena Etcher. And for Balena Etcher, the first thing we need to do is find the URL that we're going to use. And I'm following these directions here on the Raspberry Pi portion of the Home Assistant installation page. And they talk about using Balena Etcher, which is what we're doing. We're going to select Flash from URL, and they give you some options here of the different types of Raspberry Pis that you can use. We're going to use the Raspberry Pi 64-bit URL. So I'm going to copy this, and actually here's a copy button right here. And I'm going to go into Balena Etcher, and in Balena Etcher, I'm going to do a Flash from URL. I'm going to enter the valid URL, which is the one we just copied from that page. Say OK, then we'll select the target. And here's our Kingston drive that we want to use. Don't format and overwrite your operating system drive. Make sure it's the SSD. Select that one, and then we'll start to flash it. And it says I'm about to erase an unusually large drive. Well, that makes sense because typically when you're doing some sort of SSD or SD flashing, it's on a small drive. That's okay. We're going to use this entire thing. So I'm going to say yes, I'm sure, and it's going to start flashing. It's actually pretty fast because it is an SSD and it's on a USB 3.0 port, so it's going to be pretty quick. So we'll come back when this is all done flashing and validating. Okay, the flash is now complete. We can go ahead and close out Balena Etcher and pull this drive from your PC and get it ready to plug into the Raspberry Pi. So with the Raspberry Pi, we're done flashing it and it's ready to go. What we need to do is take the power, remove the power, and then remove the SD card because you don't need the SD card anymore. Now you could leave it in there because what will happen is it will boot from the SD or the SSD drive first, and then if it can't, it'll boot from the SD card. So we're going to remove the micro SD card anyway, and we're going to go ahead and plug in our new SSD drive into this. I'm going to pick a USB 3.0 port, and you can tell it's a USB 3.0 because it's blue. That's a high-speed port, and you want to use that, especially when you're doing this kind of operation, writing to or using an external SSD drive. All right, and we're going to power it back up. And as it powers back up, we're going to, you can do a couple things. You can go get a coffee and come back later or whatever. It'll take a little bit of time, but what you need to do is you need to see what kind of IP address it has been given. So if you have a router that you can access, go ahead and look and see what kind of the IP address is available to you. And so we'll check and see whenever that comes back up here in a few minutes, and we'll take the next step. Okay, so I've pulled up my router, and one thing I failed to mention is make sure you have a network cable plugged in. It's not going to work if you don't have the network cable plugged in. So I do see that I have my Home Assistant Pi 4 here, and we are waiting on it to get an IP address. And once it gets an IP address, I will be able to log into it and we'll be able to take the next step. And there it is, an IP address while I'm talking. So let's go into that IP address now. And it's going to tell me it's preparing Home Assistant. So this is good news. Number one, it means that the Raspberry Pi has booted off that SSD and that it sees it and all that part of it is good. If you run into an issue where it's not able to boot off of it, there are some cases where you need to plug in a powered USB hub and then plug the drive into the USB hub. If you're not getting enough power to your Raspberry Pi 4 to be able to power the SSD, it's not going to work. So make sure that if you're having problems and you've gone through all these steps, that you try getting a powered USB hub, plugging your SSD into that first and plugging the hub into the Raspberry Pi 4 and see if it boots up. So it says here that this can take up to 20 minutes. It's usually faster for me, but we'll let that sit and we'll come back whenever it's done and we'll take the next step. And the next step, by the way, is going to be restoring a previous snapshot of what I had on here. Because remember, it died. The SD card died, but I was keeping up with backups. And so I'm going to be able to restore back onto this. Even though it's a brand new drive, and I'm not running it on the micro SD card, I can still restore it back. So we'll see in a few minutes when this part is finished and we'll do a restore and bring everything back up to where it was before. Okay, so Home Assistant has now prepared itself, and I actually had to do a screen refresh to get it to show up the screen. It didn't automatically go to this login screen once it was done. It said it takes 20 minutes. I don't know how long it actually took. I waited about 5 and did a refresh of the browser screen. So you can go ahead and create what you want to create here now. If you want to create a user and get all set up from scratch, that's fine. But it says down here, alternately, you can restore from a previous backup. And that's what we're going to do. Because my SD card failed, I need to go ahead and pull the backup and just restore from where I was before, or to where I was before. So I'll click that button here, and here's my full backup from yesterday. And let me just go ahead and do that. So I want the full backup, and I'm going to click on restore. You could do a partial backup if you really wanted to, but we'll do a restore. And it asks if I want to wipe the system and restore this backup. I sure do. Now this will take a while because it's coming from my NAS, loading the entire, I don't know, multi-gig image, and it will put it all onto Home Assistant when it's ready to go. So once again, we'll come back when that is done and show you the end result. Okay, so the image has restored, and this is actually back to what it looked like before. All my settings are here, all my entities, everything. Even though this is a test site or a test Raspberry Pi, I still like to have everything the way it was, and it's all back. So now we're running fully on the SSD. If we go over here to Supervisor and we look at the drive, we can see here that we have 4.7% use space. So if you hover over here, we have 10 gig out of 219 gig of our space available to us. And we are running fully on the SSD. Externally, I have no SD card installed in here. So that is it in a nutshell. Super easy to do. What did we do today? We took our SD card and we flashed it with the Raspberry Pi imager to make it boot off of the USB. We plugged it into the Pi 4, booted up the USB. It took its information and wrote it to the USB's firmware so it would boot correctly. We flashed Home Assistant onto our SSD drive, and we plugged that in, let it boot up, get ready, and then restored an image from our backup to bring us back up to where we were operating before. In the past, I thought the whole SSD boot thing was a hard thing to do, but this was very easy to do. It took a couple of 3 or 4 steps, and we're up and running on the SSD. You're going to have faster data transfer. You're going to have more space. You're going to be able to put whatever size drive you want on it. So if you're running something like Frigate, now you have all this extra space, which you don't have on an SD card. And your time between failure is going to be a lot longer on an SSD versus those SD cards, as you saw already. All right, so I hope this was helpful to you. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below or in Discord. Make sure you hit that thumbs up button if you liked the video. If you're not a subscriber, I'd love you to subscribe. If you're not a channel member, I would love for you to join the channel as well. It helps support me in what I do here. And with that, we will see you on the next video.